Hi everyone, I will take you through the lesson Inventory Transaction Setup. After completing this lesson, we should be able to describe how inventory transactions are used and understand how to create inventory transaction sources and types, and we should be able to explain system and user defined inventory transaction types and explain various types of inventory transaction setup user interfaces, and also we'll go through few profile options related to inventory transactions. So the first topic for the lesson is on inventory transaction uses. So what is an inventory transaction? So inventory transaction basically refers to an item's movement into, within or out of inventory. So whenever a transaction takes place, it changes the quantity, it changes the location, the planning responsibility, and the cost of the item. So Oracle Fusion Inventory Management supports a number of predefined and user-defined transaction types. So in this diagram or on that particular slide, what you're seeing, there are 4 examples. So the first one is you are basically receiving items into the organization based on a purchase order receipt. And the second one is you are transferring the material between 2 organizations, which is inter-org transfer or inter-organization transfer. So the third one, what you see on that particular on the slide is transfer of move items within the organization, that is within the organization between 2 sub-inventories, which is called as sub-inventory transfer. And if you are issuing items out of the organization, it is a sales order issue. So inventory transaction sources and types. So the inventory transaction types basically classify and categorize the movement of material into and within your organization and issuing the material out of your organization, as we have just discussed. And we also have taken the examples of receiving the items into the organization, issuing the items out of the organization, transferring of the items from one sub-inventory in the organization to another sub-inventory, or transferring item across organizations, or shipping an item to a customer based on a sales order. So these are few examples of inventory transaction types. So in this particular diagram, just like in the previous slide, we have 3 examples. In the first example, what you could see here is there is an inter-org transfer happening from organization M1 to organization M2. So the source organization is the M1 and the destination organization here is M2. And coming to the second example, it depicts the sub-inventory transfer happening from a sub-inventory FGI, that is the finished goods inventory, to a destination. The destination is the sub-inventory stores. And in the final example, we are basically issuing the material to the customer, or you are sending the material to the customer based on a sales order. So the transaction type here is sales order issue. This particular screenshot, what you could see here is depicting the manage inventory transaction sources and types page, where we actually create the transaction source and the transaction types. We will be able to see all the predefined transaction sources and transaction types from this particular page. So the transaction type is used to classify the transactions, as we have just given the examples. Some of the transaction types are the purchase order receipt, the sales order issue, the sub-inventory transfer, etc. So we can say a transaction type is a combination of transaction source and transaction action. So the transaction source is basically the type of entity against which a transaction is charged. Just to give an example of transaction source, it could be a physical inventory, movement request, purchase order, sales order, account areas. These are all examples of transaction sources. So what would be a transaction action? So transaction action is a system defined type of material movement. It could be a receipt into the stores, it could be issue from the stores, or cycle count adjustment, physical inventory adjustment, in transit receipt, direct organization transfer, sub inventory transfer. All these are examples of transaction actions. It is a system defined type of material movement. System and user defined inventory transaction types. So as part of this section, we would be discussing system and user defined inventory transaction types. These are the ones predefined inventory transaction types in the system, which we could use. An inventory transaction setup task. So this particular table shows additional inventory transaction setups along with their descriptions. So some of them are the manage account aliases. So this manage account aliases user interface is used to define easily recognized names or labels representing a general ledger account number. So this is a configuration which you need to do if you want to do any if you want to create inventory transaction type against the transaction source account aliases. Inventory transaction profile options. So there are a couple of profile options related to the inventory transactions. So please go through them. And just to highlight here certain terminologies. Background processing. So background processing is upon commit, the control returns immediately to you, allowing you to continue working. So if it is concurrent processing, upon commit, the inventory management spawns the concurrent process and returns control immediately to you, allowing you to continue working. And it displays the concurrent request number representing the concurrent process executing the miscellaneous issue and receipt transactions. So there are a few more profile options which you could go through, and let us spend some time on the instance. There is a small demonstration on how to set up an inventory transaction. So let me take you all through the instance. Currently I'm on the home page. So now let me click on setup and maintenance on the home page on the springboard. Now under the offerings, let us select manufacturing and supply chain materials management. So now you could see the various functional areas against this particular offering, manufacturing and supply chain materials management. So let us select inventory management functional area. So now once you select the inventory management functional area on the left hand side, you could see all the tasks related to inventory management functional area. So now select the task manage inventory transaction sources and types. So now let us go ahead and create one new or user defined transaction source. So you could see here in the column defined by, you could see the predefined ones will be with the name system. So these are the ones which have been defined by the system or the predefined ones, and the user defined ones you could see you will be seeing the value as defined by user. So let us click on create under the transaction source. So now what we are doing is we are creating a transaction source. So let me select inventory transaction source, say with my initials. So I'm creating an inventory transaction source. So click on save and close. So you could see here, this is a user defined inventory transaction source which we have created. So now let me select this inventory transaction source and let us select the transaction type. Let us create one inventory transaction type against that particular transaction source, inventory transaction source VA, which we have just created. So click on the plus sign here. So now let us create an inventory transaction type. So now you could use any of the system provider or system defined transaction actions. So those are the direct organization transfer, in-transit shipment, issue from stores or receipt into stores, and sub-inventory transfer as we have discussed during the slides. So let me select here the transaction action as issue from stores and click on save and close. So what we have done is we have created a inventory transaction type. What we could say is this is a combination of the transaction source and the transaction action, which we have discussed during the slide. The inventory transaction is a combination of inventory, the transaction source and the transaction type. So let us save and close and let us go back to the presentation. So in this lesson, we have learned how to describe inventory transactions, and we have seen how to describe inventory transaction sources and types, and we also have seen how to create the system and user defined inventory transaction types, and we also have gone through few inventory transaction profile options as well. Thanks everyone for attending this particular short topic.